Hi everyone, I'm Robert Lowe.
And I'm Luke Lawrence. Hello.
This forum is titled Duoethnography in English Language Teaching, Research, Reflection and Classroom Application. In this forum, we're going to start by introducing duoethnography as a research method and look at some of the different ways that it's been employed in language teaching. This forum is based on this recently published book, which we edited, of the same title as the forum, and we're very lucky to have some contributors and authors in the book to give their reflections on their chapters.
Yeah, so let's get started. So we're going to introduce duoethnography first of all, and just let you know a little bit about it and how it's done. So let's start with a definition. So the definition is it's a qualitative research methodology in which two researchers utilize dialogue to juxtapose their individual life histories in order to come to new understandings of the world. So what that means basically is that you have two or sometimes three, or I guess more is possible, and they're using their own, they engage in dialogue and conversation and using their own experiences and their own life histories in order to investigate a certain topic.
So I'll give a little theoretical background now on duoethnography. It was developed by two researchers called Norris and Sawyer in 2004. You can see some examples of books which they've either authored or edited on the method here on the slide. Theoretically, it's based in post-structuralism and postmodernism, so the rejection of grand narratives, focusing more on individual life histories, kind of disrupting grand narratives, which we'll get to a little bit later on. In terms of the methodology, it's based partly in autoethnography and partly in narrative inquiry. Autoethnography is a form of ethnography where a researcher researches their own life. They take their own life as the research site. And this is meant to provide more of a personal voice and also to look at how a particular phenomenon affects an individual person, rather than trying to construct a broader picture of how the phenomenon interacts with society. Narrative inquiry looks at how people construct stories and tell stories about their lives to explore topics such as identity and so on. So duoethnography takes these ideas of autoethnography and narrative inquiry, but adds a more dialogic aspect where two people's life histories are being compared and contrasted as a kind of multi-sited research project.
Okay, so let's move on to the aims and approach of duoethnography. So as Rob just mentioned, it's looking at life stories, it's looking at personal experiences, and the idea is to kind of disrupt grand narratives. So the kind of stories that we tell ourselves, or the taken for granted assumptions that we think we know, we use these individual stories to kind of go against these grand narratives that we are told every day of our lives. And linked to that is ideas around social justice. So in this way, particularly in our field of ELT, it can be linked to critical pedagogy and ideas of social justice in education. And part of it is also accessibility. So Rob mentioned the idea of dialogues and this narrative approach. So the idea of that is it kind of gets rid of some of the more traditional kind of old-fashioned forms of research, and it makes the research process itself accessible to researchers and also people that don't necessarily do research, for example, busy practicing teachers, trainee teachers, newly qualified teachers, and people like that. And then the end product, the research paper itself, if one is written, is also more accessible to readers. So by putting it in this dialogic form, kind of makes it easy to read, easily accessible. And the idea is that hopefully these ideas of disrupting grand narratives and social justice will be brought to a wider range of people.
So how do you do a duoethnography? Well, typically, a duoethnography starts with multiple recorded discussions between the participants. In this case, the participants are, of course, also the researchers. So these can be recorded in any number of ways. Some people do recorded face-to-face meetings, like audio recorded or sometimes video recorded. Sometimes these are text-based exchanges over messaging software and social networks and things like that. But the main point is that the researchers / participants engage in multiple recursive recorded discussions. There's a lot of interplay between each of the discussions as people refer back to things that they've discussed previously. Once you've gathered a large amount of data and you think things are starting to emerge, you engage in thematic coding. So this is where you go through the data in an iterative fashion and try to find patterns, emergent themes, and try to see what the data is telling you about the particular phenomenon that you want to research. Once you've finished coding, you try to turn it into a research report. Now, this is done typically in two different ways. The most common ways that, that geoethnography is written down is dialogically. So the geoethnography is written as a full dialogue, as you can see in the example on screen here. This doesn't mean you're giving necessarily verbatim data extracts. Quite often these dialogues are kind of reconstructed, so they're written in a sort of play script style. The idea is that the dialogue, the text of the dialogue is not necessarily what you said, but the substance of the dialogue is reflective of what was said in your discussions. One of the reasons for doing this is because, as Luke said previously, it makes the final research report much more accessible, especially to people who aren't used to reading academic texts. It's a very accessible way into the material. So that's a common way that duoethnographies tend to be produced. A second way is more traditionally as a standard research report. So here people provide, extracts from the data or screenshots, things like that, and then have more generic discussions about the data underneath. And both of these are totally valid ways of doing duoethnography. One of the nice things about duoethnography is it's not very prescriptive. It's based on a set of principles, and you can use those principles to produce, a study in the way that you think is best.
Okay, so the book itself is broken down into three sections: research, reflection, and classroom application. These are the three main uses of geoethnography that we've been able to find, at least in the ELT field. I'm sure there are many more uses, but we'll just go through them quickly. So for research, it's been used for teacher identity a lot, and also investigating critical issues. I think the kind of intimate nature of it allows a little bit more kind of depth than traditional methods of research allow. They allow kind of personal storytelling, and the fact that you've got two researchers kind of playing against each other, playing off against each other, often kind of encourages the other one to kind of dig deeper than they possibly would if they're doing an autoethnography, and even kind of than they would if they are a traditional researcher interviewing a participant who perhaps is a little bit cautious to go that a little bit deeper. So I think geoethnography is really, really useful for that kind of research. It's also used for reflection as a reflective practice tool. So this is for teacher training, but also for teacher development, so allowing teachers to engage in dialogue, again, with colleagues or whoever, to reflect on their own development, their own teaching practices, and things like that. And the third use of geoethnography that we identify and is in the book is classroom application. So using it as a classroom project for learners to engage in, multi-skilled project, basically, for any language learners of all levels to engage in.
So, as we already mentioned, this forum is based on our recently published book, and we'd like to give a little bit of background to this book. How did we come to use duoethnography, and how did we end up turning it into this written project? So, the first duoethnography in ELT was by Lowe and Kitch-Kowiak. So, me and a fellow researcher, Marek Kiczkowiak, were interested in our experiences of being a so-called native speaker and a so-called non-native speaker of English, and how that had affected our careers. And we were looking for a research method which would help us to explore that. And we came across Duoethnography, and it seemed to be kind of the perfect way in. So this was kind of the first attempt at using Duoethnography in ELT, and we found that it was quite useful. Later on, me and Luke started discussing some similar ideas at a conference, which led to us producing a second paper on native speakerism, which is something that we're both interested in as researchers. And again, we used Geoethnography to compare our backgrounds. And then Luke started working with another colleague. Do you want to explain your process a little bit there?
Yeah, so around the same time, myself and a colleague of mine, Yuzuko Nagashima, we were interested in exploring kind of our own kind of diversity of our different experiences as teachers. So we started engaging in a project as well, and kind of accidentally it became a Geoethnography. And that was looking at the intersectionality of gender and sexuality, race and native speakerness. And that became a paper that was published last year. Sorry, go on, Rob.
Yeah, and in addition to that, we started kind of evangelizing about Duoethnography at conferences, both in Japan and in the UK. And as a result of that, we got, you know, a few other people interested. Eventually, we formed this kind of small community of interested researchers and practitioners who were using Geoethnography, sometimes more for research purposes, sometimes more for reflective practice purposes. There seemed to be a lot of interest in how Duoethnography could be applied in different situations. So from that community, we drew a bunch of interested people together, and that's how we ended up with the book, which is kind of showcasing all of the work being done by this community of researchers, reflective practitioners, and in our case, also teachers trying to use Geoethnography in the classroom.
So this is the final product. So this was published by Multilingual Matters earlier this year, March 2020. And this includes everything that we've just been talking about now.
So what's coming up in the rest of this forum? Well, as we mentioned, there are 3 parts to the book focusing on research, reflection, and classroom application. First, we have a presentation from Daniel Hooper, Momoko Oka, and Aya Yamazawa called Not All Eikaiwas or Instructors Are Created Equal, a trio ethnography of native speaker and non-native speaker perspectives on English conversation schools in Japan. So here they review the main topics of their trio ethnography as presented in the book, and this is a good example of using Geoethnography for research. To illustrate part 2 of the book on reflective practice, we have Matthew Turner and Nick Kasparek with Reassembling the Puzzle, Returning to Our Duoethnography. Rather than looking at their chapter and presenting about their chapter directly, Matt and Nick have chosen to go back and reflect on the Geoethnography. So we have one more recursive level of reflection happening here. So this is a very interesting way of looking at reflective practice through Geoethnography. Finally, to illustrate the parts of the book focusing on classroom application, Luke and I will talk about Duoethnography in the language class. So we'll explain some of our experiments with using Duoethnography, some of the benefits we think students get from using Duoethnography, and we'll give some examples from our research into our classroom experiments with the method.
Okay, so thanks very much for watching this far. So as Rob said, next is Daniel Hooper, Momoko Oka, and Aya Yamazawa, and we'll be back at the end to talk about classroom application. Thank you.
Okay, hi everyone. Welcome to this presentation. My name is Daniel Hooper. I'm a lecturer at Kanda University of International Studies. But I spent the majority of my career in Eikaiwa schools. I worked for about 3 years in a large chain Eikaiwa school, and then another 5 years in a smaller family-owned Eikaiwa. I was just really interested in researching more about it. How about you, Momoko?
Hi everyone, my name is Momoko. I currently work at Kanda Institute of Foreign Languages, and also I work at one cram school in Tokyo. But before joining those schools, I used to work at one of the biggest Eikaiwa schools in Japan, where I met Aya. We worked for about 3 years together, and I end up working there for about 5 years in total.
Okay, hello everyone. My name is Aya Yamazawa. I currently work for 2 different vocational schools, including Kanda Institute of Foreign Languages. But before that, I worked for 2 different Eikaiwa schools. The first one, I was a head teacher and worked for 3 years. And for the next one, I was a sales rep and also worked for 3 years.
Okay, so we're just gonna briefly give you guys a background of, why we got interested in this project and, what was the inspiration behind it. So in my case, I had already been doing kind of some research, kind of EMIC research within Eikaiwa. But I was really attracted to this project because I would be working with Momoko and Aya. Basically, I was really curious about a Japanese perspective on, Eikaiwa teaching practice. Although I had Japanese colleagues, they were mainly in a kind of administrative role. So I was really, really keen to kind of pick Momoko and Aya's brains about Japanese teachers' perspectives on pedagogy within Eikaiwa.
My inspiration to get involved in this project was basically I was really happy about working at my school back then, but I wanted to talk to other teachers from other schools as well. That's when Luke, the editor of the book, introduced me to Dan. And as I said, Aya and me were working together. So I just introduced Aya to Dan as well. And at that time, I was really interested in native speakerism because I wanted to be regarded equally as native English teachers.
So for me, working for 2 different Eikaiwa schools, I had a frustration towards the dichotomy between non-native and native-speaking teachers. For the first school, I was a head teacher and I had a lot of respect as a teacher. But for the second one, as a sales rep, I had this experience of native-speaking teachers were kind of superior. People thought that they were better than Japanese teachers. And so I found out about this research. Momoko told me about this, and meeting Dan, I was very excited about sharing this experience with other teachers.
Okay, so we're gonna start by giving a brief kind of literature review relevant to this study, and then we're gonna get stuck into the data itself, and then we'll finish by kind of giving our reflections. So in terms of research on Eikaiwa, the first thing to note, which we might have kind of alluded to, was there's not very much. And what does exist is kind of from a very outsider perspective, generally like researchers rather than Eikaiwa teachers. So this is something we really wanted to address. Another issue that we were interested in maybe examining is the idea of Eikaiwa being portrayed within academia and also in, I guess, like general Japanese society as this kind of uniform entity. Oh, it's an Eikaiwa school, and it's talked about in very kind of umbrella terms, as if like it's assumed people know what it means. But I personally, I was very influenced by Mark Makino's work on the taxonomy of Eikaiwa schools. So looking at different facets of Eikaiwa Gakko and how it's more complex than people, you know, might believe. Linked to this is another prevalent and kind of a negative idea attached to Eikaiwa of it being prioritizing profit over educational value. And tied to this idea is the kind of derogatory term Muk English, drawing a parallel between Eikaiwa Gakko and the fast food industry. For example, churning out a kind of low grade product and relying on kind of unskilled labor, which is of course very kind of pejorative and demeaning for Eikaiwa teachers. Another point that kind of came out of the literature on Eikaiwa is the idea of akogare. And akogare, in regards to Eikaiwa or even ELT research or TESOL research is quite a narrow concept. Although the actual word in Japanese, akogare, has a wide range of kind of meanings or kind of applications, akogare within TESOL is generally refers to a kind of eroticized fantasy desire of generally Asian women towards Caucasian men. This is seen in the kind of Charisma Man cartoons. Also linked to this is the idea of casual leisure. Eikaiwa being, rather than for educational purposes, for fantasy, escapism, or just leisure purposes. Moving on to the research on native speakerism, in our project, we view the native speaker as a social construct. In the chapter we wrote, it was always in inverted commas to indicate that we viewed this as a subjective kind of social construction rather than an objective truth. When we talk about native speaker, and I would say especially within the context we were in, it was racialized and it was gendered. It wasn't based on speakerhood per se. Tied to this was the concepts of eigo and eikaiwa. These concepts refer to the Japanese ELT field essentially being divided in two. On one side is eigo, which is based on kind of juken, yakudoku, a kind of Japan-specific variety of the grammar translation method, which has endured since the Meiji Restoration, or arguably even before. And then the other side of Eikaiwa, which is kind of English conversation practice. And this is tainted or colored, however you want to call it, by native speakerism, white supremacy, all of these kind of hegemonic discourses. So both sides are, in a sense, racially defined. Japanese teachers teach eigo, foreign, namely Caucasian native speakers, teach Eikaiwa. And then linked to this is a kind of understanding which I got from research by Miyazato of ALTs and JTEs in secondary education, and Nuski, who looks at Eikaiwa Gakko, who defines native speakerism in Japan, the experiences of native and non-native speakers as being both privileged and marginalized. It's not a straightforward oppressor-oppressed relationship, but there is local kind of nuance attached to this kind of distinction.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about how we did this research. First, we actually met up a couple of times and we shared our ideas and experiences of being Eikaiwa teachers. And we recorded those conversations and we just brainstormed some of the topics and ideas. And then we continued talking on messengers, and also we used Skype. And we kept talking and kept sharing ideas. And then we started making the documents, shared documents. And then we decided, or we highlighted some of the keywords and topics that were brought up repeatedly in our conversations. Then once our themes were chosen, we did further research and analysis to develop our ideas on paper. So the 3 themes that we came up with, first one is perception of Eikaiwa as an institution. So we all had different experience, even though we worked in the same industry. And also we were aware of how Eikaiwa school as an industry was categorized or stigmatized. And the second theme that we decided was teacher role. Since Momoko and I taught as non-native local English teachers, we call it LETs, and Dan as a native speaking English teachers, NESTs. All of us had different expectations of who we should be. And the final theme that we decided was the confidence and respect as teachers. So our confidence as teachers were built based on this perception of nests and lets, where not only individual teachers, but also as a community, we sometimes struggled to fit in.
Okay, so the first theme we're going to look at is perception of Eikaiwa as an institution. I don't think we can discuss Eikaiwa without addressing whether or not business interests can really coexist with an honest desire to provide quality education. From my experiences in Eikaiwa schools, I didn't really feel the business concerns enhance the quality of the instruction provided. Conversely, I found there were many times where the drive for profits negatively affected the quality of teaching. I feel this underlies why Eikaiwa hiring practices are generally so flawed, with minimal educational requirements and usually no teaching experience necessary. Also, in my experiences, because most of the business-related demands came from Japanese staff members, there was definitely a sense among the foreign staff of us and them. We cared about teaching and they cared about making money. As I became more interested in improving the pedagogy where I worked and grew more hostile towards the industry, I'm sorry to say that I embraced the prevalent stereotype of the Japanese staff as company people with little regard for students' language development.
Yeah, of course, I felt pressure from the head office when it came to increasing student numbers, preventing students from quitting, and basically making more money. However, I didn't want to pass that pressure on to other teachers, so I let them focus on providing good quality lessons in a comfortable environment without pressuring them about the financial side. I only missed my quarterly sales target once in 5 years. So I think I made the right decision on not stressing out other teachers about making more money for the company.
When I was a head teacher, I often felt I was a moderator in my school, understanding the needs of both sides, business and education. For me, the business pressure from the head office was so overwhelming that I decided to share the sales targets with all the staff. At the same time, I strongly believe that providing quality lessons where students can improve their English and accomplish their goals would have the best outcome.
So to summarize the section, perception of Eikaiwa as an institution. First, Dan believed education and business were mostly incompatible. This was in turn linked with a sense of us and them regarding Japanese and non-Japanese staff. On the other hand, Aya and I believed that education and business can be compatible. We believed that these tensions could potentially be resolved due to our experience as mediators. And this was an interesting point for us because 3 of us worked in the same Eikaiwa industry in Japan, but each of us had different experiences at different schools, which affected our beliefs and perspectives on the Eikaiwa industry. Through our conversations, we realized the idea that Eikaiwa is in fact diverse and that each school can have a vastly different balance.
Okay, now we're going to move on to our second theme, teacher role. Over the last 6 months, we've been debating these issues. I've noticed that the socially ascribed roles of NES and LETs in Japan have run through almost all of our discussions. Rather than an authoritative teacher, I often felt as if I was merely assigned the role of entertainer, curiosity, or professional foreigner. No one in my company really cared that I was doing my MA, as it didn't really factor into what they were selling.
Yeah, actually, I've always felt that foreigners were like mascots. Yeah, sorry, it sounds kind of negative. However, on the other hand, I have always felt that I could never compete with NEST, regardless of my teaching competence. To some, NEST's presence in the classroom has great value. Recently, I saw an advertisement for a kids' Eikaiwa school, which said, practice and rehearse with LETs before the real thing. For some Japanese people, the NEST presence itself gives students a reason to learn English and motivates them to keep attending lessons. NEST are like the mascots in an exciting theme park filled with special performances, an exotic culture, and fundamentally removed from reality.
Actually, at one point, one of you guys said that you didn't know if NES actually knew how to be strict, and that was why they had this playful presence in class. To be honest, this made me feel quite uncomfortable and highlighted to me how deeply the Eigo Eikaiwa ideology or native speakerist beliefs are embedded in teachers' consciousness in Japan. During my time in Eikaiwa, I witnessed many times where teachers were reprimanded or even fired for being too serious, not smiling enough, or because their classes weren't fun. These were not lax backpackers, but rather experienced and passionate teachers who were pressured by the school to conform to a stereotype of what nests should be.
Okay, so for this section, we discussed the categorization of teachers, not only in Eikaiwa industry, but also in Japanese societies. Nests are often expected to be fun and entertaining, whereas lets need to be serious. We all had frustration towards this idealization. So this affected our teacher identity.
Okay, so the final section we're going to discuss is confidence and respect as teachers.
Now I'm looking for a job, and when I respond to an ad that says they need Japanese teachers of English, they always get back to me, but if I see ads for nests or native level English teachers, I don't hear anything from them. This makes me feel that while things might seem to be changing on the surface, basically things are very much the same as before. It's like these schools are trying to get away with native speakerism by just rewarding it as native level teachers.
Yes, unfortunately, I've had the same concerns about job postings I've seen online. On the other hand, however, I perceived a gap in the respect that lets and nests were afforded through my experiences in Eikaiwa. Parents and some adult students would often defer to Japanese staff, despite them knowing I was upper intermediate in Japanese and more highly qualified. This reinforced the idea that we were not seen as authoritative teachers.
In my current company, lets are considered to be secondary. Despite having high English proficiency and usually being successful in helping students to achieve test goals, they are basically part-time and limited to teaching children and English grammar to adults. This department stays small despite profit growth and the overall number of teachers increasing. What frustrates me most is that school counselors and teachers themselves accept that nests are superior. And what's worse, they are all Japanese teachers undermining their own worth.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting that we share similar frustrations, but from different sides of the nest-let divide. You were annoyed at a lack of critical awareness among your Japanese co-workers regarding the dominance of nests in your company. For me, I got annoyed with my nest co-workers for the same lack of criticality in terms of both recognizing our deprofessionalization and the privilege that many of us were abusing as unqualified native speakers. Essentially, we are highlighting irritation with the unquestioning acceptance of native speakerism from both sides of the issue.
Okay, so in this section of confidence and respect as teachers, we all found that both native and non-native Eikaiwa teachers experienced a range of threats to their authority as teachers. Native speakers as lacking professional authority and non-native speakers as lacking linguistic authenticity. In addition to that, I believed that job postings were still reproducing native speakerist beliefs, but that they were often disguising it by using different terms, such as native level English teachers instead of native English teachers. And Aya and Dan both found that a lack of criticality in the community of teachers they worked with frustrated them in Eikaiwa. They felt similar frustrations, but different sides of the nest and let divide.
Okay, so now finally we're going to give you some kind of reflections from each of us on the project that we've just told you about, and also maybe some ideas based on our experience of doing not a duo ethnography, a trio ethnography. In my case, this project had a huge impact on my perspective on Eikaiwa and my research interest in general. As you've probably gleaned from our data, I had a very negative view of the Eikaiwa industry, but thanks to Aya and Momoko's perspectives on this, I turned a corner with it, and it actually culminated in me editing a book, basically kind of grounded in the ideas that Aya and Momoko introduced to me of Eikaiwa not being uniform, being diverse, and having a lot of pedagogical value. So yeah, it had a huge impact on me. In terms of the kind of logistics of doing a trio ethnography, I thought it was great that we had multiple lines of communication, like we used Messenger, Skype, face-to-face meetings, etc., email, shared documents. It was really useful, and we could go back and forwards through the literature in kind of an iterative process. On the other hand, it was difficult in that there were three of us. We had different writing styles, different level of familiarity or like with the literature, different experience in terms of like academic formatting, etc. So that was a little bit tough, but you know, we got there. It was fine in the end. I was very proud of it. How about you guys, Momoko?
For me, I really liked this project because I was basically happy at my school, but through this project, I realized how lucky I am to have worked at one of the biggest Eikaiwa companies in Japan, and overall experience was good for me. And after leaving the Eikaiwa school, I joined Kanda Institute and one cram school, and I still use Eikaiwa techniques whether I was working as an Eikaiwa teacher or Eigo teacher. I teach TOEFL and IELTS for students. So I'm a Eigo teacher / Eikaiwa teacher. So I still believe those dichotomy is not necessary. And trio ethnography, it was really good. Because I knew Aya before, but we never talked about this stuff. So we went deeper. And also, I met Dan, who was really passionate about Eikaiwa industry. And it was, I feel really privileged to have worked you guys. And I want to say thank you to Luke and Rob, presenters as well.
For me, I just simply was happy to be able to share my frustration as a Japanese English teacher. Working for two different Eikaiwa schools, I had completely different experience. And Momoko and I worked for the same company for the first 3 years. So we kind of had the similar experience and ideas about Eikaiwa schools, but with Dan, it was completely different. And so it was quite interesting and eye-opening. Also for this Duoethnography, without Dan and Momoko, I would never have done anything like this, like research. This is my first time I actually read menu literature and I tried writing. And so I am so honored to have this opportunity of being involved in this kind of research. So I am thankful for you two.
Okay, so that's all from us. If you have any questions, please contact us. I can provide our contact information to Rob and Luke. So yeah, please don't hesitate to contact us. And yeah, thank you for coming and thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Matthew Turner.
I'm Nick Kasperik.
And welcome to our presentation today. Now, earlier this year, we published a chapter in Rob and Luke's edited book, and our Geoethnography was all about our experiences with special educational needs teaching. Just to give you some background, special educational needs, or SEN, refers to situations where learners have a significantly greater difficulty in learning than the majority of others around. And of late, in Japan, universities have seen more and more students with a registered disability entering university, almost 38,000 in 2019. What this has meant is that teachers and departments alike have had to find ways to make reasonable accommodations for their students in order to provide quality education for them. However, support for teachers like us in Japan is currently lacking, and teachers need to find ways to professionally develop themselves in order to address these issues. So this is what we did with our Duoethnography. Our Duoethnography was a way to plot and record our ongoing learning processes with this topic. And it was also a way to help us articulate our complex opinions and ideas around this topic. In writing our Duoethnography, it provided a story for other teachers who have similar experiences in the field. And through the process of constructing our Duoethnography together, we realized that we had some different orientations to the issue. However, as we said at the end of our chapter, while this duoethnographic inquiry accurately captures our thoughts, feelings, and orientations in that particular period, our ideas about this complex topic have continued to develop since. So, what we'd like to do today in this session is we'd like to return to our chapter and think about how our ideas have developed since. In doing so, we follow a similar study by Brown, who looked at her 3 duoethnographies and used them to spur further inquiry and reflection. And this session and our previous chapter do in fact work as a form of reflective practice for both me and Nick. Now, our session today is going to be a dialogic one in which we are not simply disseminating our ideas, but we are using it as a site of new discovery with each other. And what you're about to see is a conversation recorded previously in which we genuinely had no idea about each other's points that we were going to raise. So what you're seeing is genuine learning and genuine discovery between the two of us. Okay, so without further ado, here is our conversation. Okay, so in our initial duoethnography, in lieu of having a conventional literature review section, we talked through our understanding of Sen at the time with reference to literature. And it's about this first section that we're going to reflect on. So Nick, I believe that you've selected a quote or an extract from our original Geoethnography that you'd like to talk about.
Yeah, so in the chapter, I started with my early thoughts about Sen and how it transitioned into seeing it from more of a specialist field to something that I could be involved in and that we could be involved in as university EFL teachers. And by the end of our discussions, I came to the kind of conclusion that mediated learning experiences is kind of something that all learners need. So catering to Sen learners is not really catering to in any specialized way, but that's just good teaching overall. So I kind of came to this overall ethos. And looking back on it now, I wondered if this framing is might still betray a bit of deficit thinking in my approach, that like I'm still kind of focusing on special needs as kind of a lack that I need to fill for them. Or I also wondered if this might be a bit impractical, trying to make it like everybody's a winner, like it's too easy and too neat in a way. So I've recently been thinking about some disability scholars' work on misfitting, and it's a very similar idea about how this misfitting is something that we all experience, but not in quite the same positive way, but as something more of a traumatic way that does still have generative potential. So yeah, it's a bit less rosy, but also a bit more creative. I thought like we might use this as a prompt for deeper change.
So this idea of misfitting, then, that's rather than the teacher kind of saying to themselves, universally, I'm going to kind of mediate and tailor to everyone. We ourselves need to kind of see ourselves as having kind of misfit kind of characteristics, and that should be where the kind of the discussion is. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I think that was it came through a little bit in the old quote that appealed to me, but yeah, this sensitivity towards like a broader sense of misfitting and how we're all kind of misfitting into the classroom in different ways at different times, and using that as like opportunities to make positive changes for every student. Yeah.
I see. Okay, and that kind of dovetails into some points that I'm going to be making later, but also it kind of relates to the point that I'd like to bring up too. So I found this quote. This kind of struck me. This quote. Reading this again, I'll just say it. It is also my understanding that the use of the word difficulty could be problematic. And yeah, at the time, this was something that I think we both identified, using these kind of terms such as difficulty or differences as perhaps not being not progressing things, and being a bit kind of looking backwards at things. And this kind of, although you actually wrote about it in the initial Duoethnography, I've since kind of learned that this is perhaps what we define as a medical model, which places emphasis on the individuals with conditions. And you mentioned this before, but this wasn't something that I kind of thought about deeply enough. And I've come to realize that we're kind of working more broadly within the social model paradigm that kind of sees society as kind of perpetuating these barriers. And yeah, you mentioned something in your part just now, and yeah, what does this mean practically? You know, how can we not use a medical model in education when these barriers already exist? You know, I don't think you can kind of retroactively, you can apply a social model of thinking, but there are already these kind of these barriers in place that you need to kind of look at the student's disability to make changes. So yeah, I think you kind of mentioned about the word practicalities.
Yeah. I also wonder if we kind of keep getting pulled back into a medical model or a deficit model of thinking, just because that's kind of in the air or deeply ingrained in us. And we have to keep reminding ourselves of the social model, and that the problem is not in the student, it's in the environment, it's in the way that we've set up the systems.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Well, let's reflect again on this kind of mini conversation later.
Sounds good. So for now, let's focus on our co-teaching experience with one Sen learner, which was formative for both of us.
Yeah.
And yeah, for me, I wrote in the chapter about how like taking this safe experimental approach within a support network, and yeah, going through the whole successful process was very valuable for me, and that I felt like this might point a way forward for future SEN learner education. And yeah, this has been reinforced by my reading in teacher education scholarship, where many scholars talk about taking an inquiry stance to teaching and continuing to learn through in the classroom by not seeing like students as problems, but or like learning difficulties as problems, but as puzzles to solve, just like we did.
Wow.
And yeah, I also was reminded that like all curricula needs mutual adaptation, like students need to adjust to it, but the curriculum also needs to adjust to the students. And I felt like this experience, I wondered after all of this, if I would have noticed a student like ours, I probably would have noticed something, but I don't think I would have really perceived the same way if we didn't have this opportunity to focus. Yeah.
Right, yeah. Yeah, and yeah, like just what you said there, for me, that idea of kind of seeing, of, you know, having this experience has kind of, yeah, opened my eyes to other issues, being a bit more sensitive to other students. I often when I hear a colleague, for example, talking about students that they see as being problematic, I always question, well, is there something behind that you're not considering? And yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. And you had another quote as well. Yeah.
Yeah. So this was, you know, this is again something that really stood out for me here, and this is something that continues to kind of preoccupy me, and I've put it on the other side there.
Sorry. Yeah.
You know, this is a feeling that continues to preoccupy me. Who is this all really for? And I don't know, I still have this kind of deep down kind of concern or worry that these kind of activities that we're doing are being kind of taken on or engaged with for our own development. And what I mean by that is our own kind of gathering of kind of research activities, publications, presentations. And I don't know, I think everybody would say the same thing, or question anything they're doing. But yeah, I still have this kind of deep down question about who is this all really for? And that's the same as it was 2 years ago when we wrote this original piece.
Right. That reminds me of something that I'll pick up on later on, about the idea of being useful to, who is it useful to, and multiplying that to, as the theorist Sarah Ahmed wrote about diversity work. And yeah, I think that as long as we keep the focus on making it useful to the student, like it can be useful to other types of students, it can be useful to us, it can be useful. But yeah, primary, I agree, like it should be, first of all, useful to the student, for the student.
And there's another kind of point that is kind of motivating me to kind of question these original words again in Reds, is that I think at the time when we did take on our collaborative project together, there were other kind of parties involved that, I don't know, maybe we weren't so acknowledging or aware that they may have kind of quite different sensitivities or perspectives to what we ultimately did. And I wonder if our activities were somehow a kind of response or reaction to what they initially did. And I wonder whether we should be a bit more we should have utilized some of those those experiences, perhaps.
Mhm.
I'm not articulating it well, but yeah, I think maybe in hindsight, maybe we could have been a bit more encompassing and reflexive of
Yeah.
those individuals.
Right. I think that's always the aim. We could always do more, and that's the the hope for next time. Right?
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the next topic. Okay, so in the original Duoethnography, we also had a section in which we reflected and developed an understanding of what our lingering concerns were. And these concerns still linger, but we're just going to reflect now how these may have changed. So Nick, what did you choose here?
Yeah, I pulled out a quote about my worst case scenario of SIN education and how it might devolve into a situation where different types of SIN learners are kind of competing for resources, scarce resources, and competing for advocates and inclusion. And yeah, so maybe contrasting what I mentioned before about this ideal of being totally universal and being great for everyone, the opposite might occur. And yeah, this came back into my mind during the pandemic, and how like we're all having to focus our energy on doing the best we can in this situation, and maybe being totally inclusive might be low on the list of priorities in some cases. So I worry about that going on, and it's kind of similar to my worst case scenario. Not quite yet, but getting closer. And yeah, that also your previous point about like being useful to, who's this all for, what's it all for, comes back to what I talked about Ahmed's ideas of yeah, being useful to the students themselves, and not worrying about like usefulness to society or like making it pay off in material terms or anything like that. So I wanted to avoid some of these dangerous side roads that we could go down, especially during the pandemic. Yeah.
So you're kind of cautious of a kind of a superficial, yeah, you use the term diversity work, like kind of superficial engagements with diversity.
Yeah, I do worry that if it is so positive, if we paint it as of course it's great for everyone, then it might be lost in times when I'm like, okay, this is now it's serious, so we can't pay attention to this extra stuff. Or yeah, so what Ahmed refers to as diversity work is much deeper and more requiring more radical change in ourselves, and
okay.
yeah, making that the priority.
Right, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so in terms of my lingering concerns, and this is a very different point to what you raised, actually. And again, I worried at the time that bringing up issues about special educational needs would be stigmatic for businesses. And now that I kind of work in a tourism faculty at a university, and I've engaged a bit with accessible tourism, I've actually come to learn that in certain industries such as tourism, that establishments that make meaningful changes to their practice actually increase reputability. And yeah, so this made me kind of hopeful that I think schools could do the same thing, that if schools, like you said, made actual meaningful attempts, and teachers to accommodate these students and make themselves more accessible, I think things like business and profitability will go hand in hand with that and increase.
Right. So yeah, that's I guess the other side of the coin, that there's no reason that it would be a negative, or it would be an extra. Like it could be a core benefit for universities. Yeah.
But I still question, I don't have the answer to this, but I still question if it should be a school's responsibility to have these dialogues with parents. Being a parent myself, but not being a parent of a currently disabled child, it's something I can't answer, I don't think. But I wonder if there should be, if schools should have that responsibility as part of their offering.
Yeah, that also raises the question of how far ahead of society's ideas universities can be expected to go. If yeah. All right, so in the final section of our chapter, we imagined what our future directions for SIN education thought might be, and we're kind of checking in now how that's going.
Yeah.
And I remember concluding that openness to puzzles was the key, bringing back to that inquiry stance, and that the idea of privileging ethos over procedures could work. That was just my intuition based on our conversations. And yeah, I've recently been reading more into the teacher education literature, as I mentioned, and I've also found a lot of scholarship that supports this idea that the ethos can be one of the most important elements of beginning teachers' development and for current teachers. And I also, reaffirmed the idea that visibility and invisibility are really prominent, and this might be a further development of where I was before. I was talking about the possibility of encountering SEN learners, but now it might be more of a sense of like being aware, or like looking for misfitting and in myself and in others. And finally, as I mentioned before, trying to be useful to many different directions, like Sarah Ahmed forcefully argues in her book. And one more point was about providing shelter, and I thought that the accommodation and inclusion, it kind of alludes to the idea of shelter, but maybe bringing that more to the forefront could be something that I'm thinking about now.
Okay. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I guess a couple of similar points that I'd like to make. I kind of gave this very kind of, I think this was towards the end of the Geoethnography, that working with a SEN learner presents professional puzzles, leading teachers to reevaluate practice once again, prompting teachers to find innovative ways to deliver lessons. And I guess I want to start at the bottom point first, actually, and I think the word innovative is maybe problematic in hindsight.
How do you mean?
And this goes back to my kind of, I think my lingering concerns about seeing it as something I'm doing and something I'm changing and something I'm innovating and developing. And I wonder if that's the wrong term to use, to innovate, and or the wrong kind of the wrong ethos to take, perhaps, maybe. I think it is an ethos, but I wonder if the type of ethos that you talk of might be more useful and beneficial, perhaps.
Do you think it's an issue of whose innovation or who is innovating? Is the,
yeah,
the
I mean,
sticking point.
that's another point as well. And this comes down to, I think the point, well, like I say at the top there, this goes much deeper. And I guess what I mean by that is it's an intersectional issue. I think this is, and my own identity as a teacher. And, you know, we did in our original Duoethnography kind of identify ourselves. So I think, yeah, it comes back to who's innovating. Yeah. And are we the right people to be right in air quotes to be doing this? But I guess my main point here was that maybe Sen as a focus is too narrow. And I think this is kind of part of a growing movement towards accessibility. And this is a term that's kind of really got me thinking that actually this is about access, like access to education, access to learning, access to resources. And I think that Sen is part of this broader spectrum of accessibility. So I wonder if the focus on Sen is part of a broader movement.
Right, and maybe not just accommodation, but more like active, proactive inclusion, or
yeah,
bringing people in, more people into the university.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think, yeah. And I mean, we talk about when I think of the word access and accessibility, I guess I think of issues such as native speakerism, you know, access to the profession, the type of language that is presented in materials and how accessible they are. And I think it's part of this broader, it's part of a bigger thing. That's I guess what I want to say.
Right. And yeah, it relates to these material issues of structures that either allow access or don't. Yeah.
So I think for me that will be the direction I go in, maybe in the accessibility direction, and that ties with tourism too.
Definitely. So in summary, trying to reassemble our puzzle, we can see that inclusive learning, Sen education, is not a simple problem that could or should just disappear through one solution, but is something that constantly requires fresh perspectives through new expansive concepts. And these concepts might open up new trajectories of thinking and help us resist dominant modes of thinking, such as the medical model and ideas about deficits and so on. And we can also see in our conversations the dialectical growth in our thinking over time and in response to each other. And we can see how our positions sometimes changed between the two of us as we challenged each other. And we hope that a similar process of dialectical growth might be inspired in our readers and viewers as they think through this topic as well. So these are our references, and we encourage you to check them on your own time. So thank you for watching.
Yeah, we hope you enjoyed our presentation. And if you're coming to the Q&A session at JALT 2020, we look forward to answering any of your questions then. Okay, so thank you very much. Goodbye.
Hello, in case you've forgotten, I'm Luke Lawrence.
I'm Robert Lowe. And
in this final part of the forum, we're going to look at how to use geoethnography as a class-based pedagogy, as a project to do with your students. So we're going to take you through basically the different stages of how to implement a project in the classroom. Then we're going to look at some of the benefits of it. And then we're going to take you through our own research and what we've found, looking at different kinds of benefits through our own research. So let's start.
So in terms of doing a duoethnographic project, implementing a duoethnographic project, So it's very similar to how researchers or reflective teachers would use geoethnography. First of all, you set up the project. So this kind of depends on the teacher. So in some cases, in our experiments, we've given the students questions to think about in advance. Like we've assigned a topic to them. Sometimes we've let them choose a topic that they think is relevant to their lives. So you put students into groups, and then in some way you give them a topic, or they choose a topic which they want to discuss, which is relevant to their lives. The students then engage in kind of multiple recorded discussions, much like researchers would. Usually in our classes, we've tended to give them about 10 minutes per class, I think. So in the first class of the project, they have 10 minutes to discuss. After that, they go home and they have some reflection questions like, what did you learn about your partner? What did you learn about yourself? What do you want to find out more about next week? Okay, and they write some further follow-up questions. They then come back to the class a week later and they have another discussion with their partner. And you have this kind of iterative process, again, very similar to how practitioners or researchers would use the method. After 2 or 3 weeks, the students will have a bunch of discussions that they've recorded. Often they record on their smartphones, or on, if you have IC recorders, you can provide them to students. And then again, the students, very much like researchers, go through and identify themes. They look for the most common themes that emerged from their dialogues. And then they try to turn that into an actual geoethnographic dialogue. Of course, much shorter than a researcher would produce, but with all of the same features. As you can see here, we have one of the appendices from part 3 of the book. This is a student-produced duoethnography. These are fake names, of course, but you have the introduction and the literature review. You have dialogues, and you have discussions of those dialogues summarizing the major themes. So very much like researchers, the students engage in discussion, they code their data, and they write up a dialogue. And at the end, the way that we've done this, the students share their dialogue with the class, often by performing it. It's a play script style, right? So they perform it with the rest of the class.
Yeah, or in my case, my learners were a little bit more advanced. So as the example shows, I had them write up a proper research paper with literature review and dialogues and analysis and discussion and references and everything. If you think your students can handle it, make it a full geoethnography. So let's move on to the benefits. The first one, for pedagogical reasons, I guess, is that it covers all 4 skills. So you've got speaking, because basically, they're using dialogue to generate the data. Then they're going home and they're listening to their own data set. So they're using the listening skills. They are, of course, if it's a full research project, then they're going to be reading literature as well, but they're also going to be reading each other's transcripts as well, and of course, writing them as well. So you're getting all 4 skills used. It gives students a really good experience of doing empirical research in English. If you are a university teacher, as we are, a lot of them are probably just starting to do empirical research in their own language. So it's a really good chance to give them a chance to do empirical research in English in an easy to use, kind of intuitive way. In a moment, Rob's going to talk in detail about this, but it's also very useful for language development through peer interaction. And it's also very useful for group dynamics and pair dynamics. And linked to that is individual motivation as well to come out of that. So yeah, they are the main benefits, although I'm sure there are many more.
So in my chapter in the book, I talk about language development through peer interaction. So as Luke mentioned, in these projects, the students are engaged in large amounts of peer interaction when they're speaking and gathering the data. They're interacting with a peer. When they're writing, when they're collaboratively producing the final written product, they're also interacting with a peer. So through all of these processes of doing the geoethnography, the students are interacting with peers and engaging in co-construction of utterances and of texts, right? And they tend to start to construct language that perhaps individually they wouldn't be able to produce, but together, when they pool their linguistic resources, they are able to produce language which is kind of above their levels individually. So in this way, this peer interaction contributes to language development without the teacher necessarily getting involved. The students are learning from each other, and they're, you know, collaboratively increasing their language level without any input from the instructor. So in my chapter, I wanted to investigate, you know, the processes that went on in the geoethnography and to try to find some empirical examples of this happening. To do this, I tried to investigate LREs, which are language-related episodes. So during their peer interaction, I was looking for instances where they were co-constructing each other's speech, where there were problems which they were solving, and so on. As you can see on the screen, there is a categorization of LREs, which I used for this. This is drawn from a book called Peer Interaction in Second Language Learning. So we've got experimenting. So, you know, the students are experimenting with new kinds of language. We've got form-based language-related episodes, so those related to grammar. We've got lexical-based language-related episodes, those related to lexis, words, and mechanical language-related episodes, so those related to pronunciation and production. We've got correcting, so this is where students give each other feedback, okay? I think you meant to say blah, 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 something like that. Modified output, so where one student says something, another student repeats it in a new corrected or modified way, and the first student internalizes that. And then self-reflection, students looking at or thinking about their own speech and trying to correct what they perceive as being mistakes or errors. And then finally, polishing. So here, students co-construct a particular utterance or a particular feature of their language. They repeat it amongst themselves, and this eventually leads to automaticity amongst the students. So I don't have time to give a lot of examples, but you have just a couple on the screen. So here you have two students. The first one says, "I always talk with my mom," and then paused for a long time. The second student offered "about." The third student said "about" and paused for a long time. The second student said "your," very encouraging here. The first student altered this and said "my." So obviously they've understood and have been able to alter this language for their own purposes. And then they complete the utterance with "university's life." Okay, so eventually they get to "I always talk with my mom about my university's life." So here you can see the students co-constructing something. The first student, the second student, perhaps a slightly higher level, helping the first student, kind of scaffolding the first student's speech. The next example underneath, the first student says, "You speak more brother than father." It's not very clear. The second student responds, "You want to say, do I speak more than my brother or father?" The first student says, "Yes, that's right. Do you speak more than your brother or father?" And the second student says, "I don't think so." Okay, so here you've got an unclear utterance. You've got the second student giving modified output, so they're repeating it back with, and also feedback, I guess. They're repeating it back and they're modifying it, and they're asking the student directly, "Do you mean this?" And the student is internalizing that and producing the correct form of the sentence. So here, just a couple of examples, there's many more in the chapter, of students being able to increase their language level through peer interaction.
Okay, and on my side, in my chapter, I was interested in the kind of group dynamic aspects of it and how they work together as a pair and as a whole class group, and also how it increased their own individual motivation. So for this, I used Denzin's framework of emotional subjectivity. Basically, in this framework, he identifies 6 categories of emotional subjectivity: feelings in common, fellow feeling, emotional infection, emotional identification, shared emotionality, and spurious emotionality. So a lot of those are kind of taking from the idea of learning as a kind of emotion-led social activity, not simply, you know, a cognitive or psychological thing, that learners do. And it's looking at the way in which learners kind of play off each other, how different emotions are transferred from one learner to the other, how shared experiences and shared difficulties even can lead to emotional bonding, and the benefits of this kind of increased emotional attachment to a fellow learner, and how that helps to increase the actual learning process itself. So yeah, I gave a survey at the end of the course to my students, and just to find out their feelings really about all of this, and how they engage with each other and with the geoethnography process itself. So I at the beginning I was quite interested in whole class group dynamics, although the feedback on this was relatively positive. The pair work was much stronger, I found, according to the data. So geoethnography, for my students at least, they felt that it was very, very useful for pair support and collaboration. So for example, if you look at on the screen here, we've got the table. Do you feel that the experience of doing a geoethnography helped to strengthen the relationship between you and your partner? And out of 11 students, 10 said yes, and one said a little. Which is great. Also, there were some other comments just alluding to the fact that they helped each other, and that although it was a new way of working that was new to them, having the partner there with them to help them every step of the way really helped them, and also to help their learning. Yeah, this also transferred to individual motivation as well. One of the comments, for example, kind of puts together all that me and Rob have been saying. It's completely unprompted. They were given a blank, whatever, final comments. And one student commented, it was a very good opportunity, and that I could not only improve my English speaking, listening and writing skills, but also understand each other. So that comment from the student basically encapsulates most of what we've been trying to say here for the benefits of doing geoethnography as a class project.
Okay, so thank you for listening to this forum. We hope you've enjoyed learning about all of the different applications of geoethnography, both for research, for reflective practice, and for use in the classroom. If you're interested in learning more about geoethnography, of course, our book is available, Geoethnography in English Language Teaching, Research, Reflection, and Classroom Application. You can also look at some of the books that we showed earlier from the progenitors of the method, Norris and Sawyer. And we hope that some of you are inspired to try out geoethnography for yourself, either as a researcher, as a reflective teacher, or just in the classroom with your students.
Yeah, and if you have any questions or queries or anything that you want to follow up on, our contact details are there, and we would be very happy to communicate with you and help in any way we can. Yeah, thanks again for listening if you made it this far, and thank you.